The essential question for this video is, how do I add or subtract polynomials? How do I add and subtract polynomials? Now, some of these rules you've already learned, but for some of you, maybe they were difficult to understand or you never quite mastered them. You're going to have to be able to do this consistently and accurately in order to get correct answers in this class. So how do I add, subtract polynomials? On the left side of your page, you can see some fill in the blanks, and this should be something you've heard of before, like, maybe you've guessed the next word, like terms. Like terms, terms with the same variables which have the same exponents. You can only add or subtract terms, class, if they have the same variable which has the same exponent. Otherwise, you're not allowed to add or subtract them. Let's take a look at some examples of these. Which pairs of terms are like terms? 4 and -5. Now, some of you might say, well, those aren't like terms, but they are. Just because they don't have variables doesn't mean they aren't like terms. And in fact, you can even write above here this word. These are called constants. So put that word, constants. A constant means it doesn't change. There's no variable. 4 is always going to be 4. If you have a whole bunch of constants, you can add or subtract them together. You do it all the time. Okay, how about x, the variable x and 2? Well, they're not the same variable. One's x and one's a constant. So these are not like terms. You cannot add them together. How about x and 2x? Well, these have the same variable, and class, take a look. It's the same exponent. X, the exponent on x is just 1. This is x to the first power. We don't have to write the 1 there because x to the first power is just x. And this is 2 times x to the first power. Those are both the same variable. It doesn't matter that one of them has a coefficient because technically they both have a coefficient. This is just 1x and this is 2x. X plus 2x is 3x. X minus 2x is -x. So these can be added or subtracted because they are like terms. How about 3x and 2y? Well, now we've got different variables, a x and a y. Those cannot be added or subtracted. How about 3xy and 2xy? Now, just because they have two variables doesn't make any difference as long as those two variables are the same. This has an x and a y in it in this term. This has an x and a y in this term. If you have 3xy's and you put in 2 more xy's, you got 5xy's. Those can be added or subtracted. How about -x squared and 5x squared? Now take a look. Same variable which have the same exponents. X has the exponent of 2 and this x has an exponent of 2. These can definitely be added or subtracted. Oops, I got a little delay on my screen. Hang on a second. Those can be added or subtracted. Those are like terms. Okay, how about 6x squared y and 6xy squared? Now, don't be fooled on this. This has an x and a y, this term does, and this has an x and a y. But this is x squared, and this is x to the first power. And this is y to the first power, and this is y squared. Those are the same variables, but they don't have the same exponents. Again, it doesn't matter they have a 6 there. That's irrelevant. The variables are not the same exponents. They cannot be added or subtracted. And how about this last one? We've got -5 ACB and 12 BAC. And now you see, class, it doesn't matter what the order of the variables are. This has an a to the first, a to the first. C to the first, C to the first power. B to the first power, B to the first power. These two terms have the same variables, and each variable has the same exponent for the two terms, and that means they can be added and subtracted. All right, let's continue on here then. Couple note things to remind you of when adding and subtracting. When adding and subtracting polynomials, always combine like terms from left to right. This is something you should have learned in your previous math classes, we always go left to right, just like we read from left to right. And remember this rule of combining terms, PEMDAS. This is actually the rule of simplifying expressions. PEMDAS, remember what that stands for? Do the work in parentheses first if you can, simplify the parentheses, then multiply out the exponents, then multiply and divide from left to right, and then add, subtract from left to right. And this is, we always do these things, use PEMDAS when simplifying. So there is some rules on adding and subtracting polynomials. All right, let's do a couple of them. I'll have to go pretty quick on this so I can get this video done in the right amount of time. So let's go through this really quick. Class, we're going to use the vertical method for these particular examples, the vertical method. So find each sum or difference. Sum means we're adding polynomials. Difference means we're subtracting polynomials. And use the vertical method. The vertical method basically just makes a whole bunch of columns, and then you just add up what's in those columns. Let's make a few columns here. Alright, so here's what we do. Let's just take a look at this. We've got a negative a squared, so I'm going to put a negative a squared in this column. Now we're adding this. We don't have to do anything to the sign. This is just plus 2b squared. I'm going to put that in the next column. Plus 5b, that goes in this column. And now what happens is, if you find another term that has the same variables with the same exponents, they go in the same column. So now we've got plus 3a squared. That's going to go over here because we already have an a squared here. And now minus a, that's its own column. There is no term that has just an a with no exponent or with an exponent of 1, so that goes by itself. And then the b, that can go in the column with the other b term right here. Notice I didn't put plus next to the terms that are positive. I put a negative or a minus sign next to the terms that are negative. And I'm just going to go ahead now and draw a line right here. And let's go ahead and add these columns up and we'll be done. Negative a squared plus, oh by the way, let's say a plus, we're adding. Negative a squared plus 3a squared, well negative 1 plus 3 is positive 2, that's 2a squared. Notice that the variable now doesn't change. What changes is the coefficients. We just take the coefficient, negative 1, we add 3 to it, that's positive 2. Alright, the 2b squared doesn't change, and since that's a positive number, we write a plus. 5b plus b is actually 6b. And negative a doesn't do anything, it just stays by itself. And there is the answer to the question, 2a squared plus 2b squared plus 6b minus a, using the vertical method. Let's do another one. This one's going to be a subtraction, the difference. So let's make our columns. I don't know how many exactly I'll need. Let's just put 3 here and see if we need any more or not. Alright. So we've got x cubed, no problem at all. Let's put that into one of our columns. I don't care about the order of the ending answer right now. We'll talk about that later. So I've got x cubed. Alright, then we've got 2x squared. That's a different term, so that's going to go right here, 2x squared. Now, you can't just write, in this case, class, you can't just write 4x squared down here. That is a problem. Let me write it right now just to show you. I know it does go in this column, but the problem is it's not positive 4x squared. You remember your rules of distribution. This minus sign, that means you have to subtract 4x squared, and you have to subtract negative 3x. So remember, we have to distribute it. If you want to think about this mathematically, just think about this as having a 1 right here. This is minus 1 times 4x squared minus 3x. The negative 1 gets distributed to the 4x. That makes it a negative 4x. And the 4x squared, the 3x doesn't have a column yet, so we're going to put 3x over here. And that we have to distribute the negative 1 to the negative 3x, and a negative times a negative is a positive. So we don't have a negative 3x anymore. We actually have a positive 3x. We're done with our columns. Let's go ahead and write our answer. This x cubed just stays x cubed. 2x squared minus 4x squared. We know we're going to have an x squared here. This is just 2 minus 4, which is negative 2. And then our 3x just comes down, and that's a positive 3x. So there is our two binomials subtracted. The second one subtracted from the first one. All right, let's do one more. All right, I don't know how many columns I'm going to have here, so I'm just going to put a couple of them out. Let's see if we have enough. And I'll add another column if I need to. All right, let's start putting our terms into our columns. So I've got a negative a squared. In this case, remember, we're going to distribute the minus sign to the 2b squared, and we've got negative 2b squared. We're going to distribute the negative sign to the positive 5b, and that gives us a negative 5b. So far, nothing is being combined in our columns. All right, let's go to the next one. We've got a negative 3a squared. That's going to be negative times 3a squared is negative 3a squared. That can go in this bucket. Negative 3a squared. We've got a negative times a negative a. Negative times a negative is positive. So we actually have a positive a. I'm just going to write a here. And we've got one more term. Negative 1 times positive b is negative b, but that has a column already with b's in it. Here's the b column, so we've got a negative b. All right, looks like we've got all of our variables in their own columns. So let's go ahead and finish this up. Negative a squared, we know it's going to be a squared. This is negative 1. There's not a 1 written, but negative a squared means negative 1a squared. Negative 1 minus 3 is negative 4. So negative 4a squared. This is going to be our b squared terms. All we have is a negative 2, so nothing changes. This is our b column. We've got a negative 5 minus 1. Remember, this negative means it's a negative 1b. We don't have to write a 1. So negative 5 minus 1 is negative 6b. And then we've got a positive a over here. Nothing to be combined or added together. And there is your final polynomial. Negative 4a squared minus 2b squared minus 6b plus a. Again, let's not worry about the order of the terms. We'll cover that later. So there is a basic understanding of how to add and subtract polynomials.